Welcome to session 6.2. In this session, we're going to be doing row and column groups and a couple of other things just to help our site look a little better with our tables. Let's get started. First thing we're going to talk about is row groups. We can separate our rows into either headers, footers, or body of our table. This way we can use our CSS elements to be able to format to make sure that each of those different things looks the way that we want without having to add in extra text into our table itself. So with the header and the footer, we tend to put the footer second. So we do our header, then our footer, then our body. The CSS will be able to figure out where each of them goes because it knows that the header goes to the top, footer goes to the bottom, body goes in the middle. There can only be one header and one footer. You can have multiple bodies though. So you can go ahead and do different body elements if necessary if you want to add extra formatting. You still need to add your individual rows inside of your row groups. So table head is not a row in and of itself. You have to add a table row after that. So from the example here, we have our table head, and then inside of it is our table row, and then our table header inside of that. So you do have to add a little bit more HTML to make sure that you understand where things are, but it also makes the CSS much cleaner and easier to understand. So now we're going to be making our row groups in our tables. We are going to continue working with our evenings, and below the we're gonna include a table head for our header. So we can do our row group of table head and table foot and table body. So in our table here, we are gonna write our T head, and we're gonna close our head underneath the header. I just always like to keep that formatted nicely. Didn't do anything different, but now we can format our header a little different than the rest of our data. Underneath our header, we are going to do our table footer, and we're going to add in a table row and a table cell that's a call span of 8 because it's going to go across all 8 columns. We're going to then put the rest of our data inside of a T body. All the way down there. And I'm going to reformat to make everything move across nicely. We're going to hit refresh. So it knows that this is a header, and it knows that this is a footer, and it knows that footers go at the bottom. And this is the data that goes in the middle. Even though we defined our footer right after our header, that's okay. That's where it goes. When we want to format these groups, we're going to come back over here and we're going to talk about our row styles and group styles. Do you notice how having those comments in there in your CSS helps you to kind of keep your CSS formatted? It's really important when you start your own sites to comment some CSS files before you get started, just so you know what are the types of things that I'm going to be needing. So if I have table schedule and I have a T head, because we're going to format our header, we're going to change its background because we want to have our background be that pretty pink color. So RGB 153, 153, that magenta. And we're going to add the text color to be white because if the text color stays black, you're not going to be able to see it really well. See how it looks so much better being white? For our column, or for our T foot, table schedule, foot, we are going to set our background for this one to be black and our color to be white. And see how that made that black with a white background. So just to kind of keep those separate so that your header and your footer look a little different than the rest of your data, we can do those with our styles. As we explained at the beginning, columns are not individual columns on their own. They're simply a subset of cells inside of rows that happen to line up. However, so they're not explicit. But you can define a column group, which is kind of like a templating option that you can use to format a given column. A column group is defined after the table. usually also after the caption, but before the first row. So we're going, or the first row group. So we can define a column group and then be able to describe what its ID or class is and how many columns across it spans. So in the example that I have here that we're going to be doing in code in just a second is going to be a column group that has our first column for our time of day, and then the other columns are our individual day columns, and they span over 7 columns. So we can look at that and we can format each of those options differently to be able to make the page look the way that we want. We also have the concept of banded rows, or rows that go different colors, alternating colors, so the even and odd. And we do have the option with our nth of type pseudo class of doing even and odd of that type, and the row knows what that means. So when the table comes through, it knows what are the odd rows and which ones are the even rows, and you can easily set up your CSS to do your banded rows. Banded rows are great for long sets of data to be able to see all the way across in a single row. So I highly recommend, if you've got a lot of data in a table, go ahead and do the banded rows because it makes things look a little better. You usually pick 2 colors that are just kind of off of each other. So one can be light gray, one can be dark gray, one can be light blue, one can be darker blue, so on and so forth. But you can change those CSS styles as you need. Now we're going to go play with some column groups. Remember, with a table, your columns are not defined individually. Like you don't enter items going down in a column. So your column groups have to be defined up at the top, underneath the caption, before the header. In this case, we're going to make a call group. We're going to say, okay, the first one is going to be column. Its ID is going to be first column, because that's going to be where the times are. And column is going to be class. We're doing an ID instead of, or a class instead of an ID. And these are the day columns. And this spans 7, because there are 7 days. Okay. Now we're going to format those. So we're going to come back to our CSS and we're going to format those individually. So call first column, because remember that was a ID. We're going to give the first column a background of an RGB 218, 210, 218. We're going to do our days column. Remember, that's a class, so it's going to be a period. Oops, sorry. Days, day calls. And we're going to set their background to RGB 255, 220, 255. It's kind of this yellow. I'm sorry, it's pink. So you can see there, first column we made gray, and then our text here we did in this pink so that it would complement this magenta that we have hanging out up here. You may not like these colors, that's okay. If you don't like the colors are the ones that go with whatever the color scheme is of what we're working with. So they kind of make sense. It's important that your colors kind of match your color scheme because it makes everything come together. If we had made this text blue, it would have looked really strange. Even if you like blue, remember, it's not all about what colors do you like, it's about what looks good to the user. When you're working with your CSS styles, you want to remember the order of precedence, which cells override which ones. So cells are at the top. They have the highest precedence. So if you define something for a cell, it's going to override your rules or your rows or your columns or your table rules. It will just do the cell rules. So those are the highest precedence. Things like width of cells. You can set your column width for your individual cells by setting that column group, which will allow all the cells that fall into that column group to be that width. You can set the width as either a percentage of 100% or an individual pixel size. I recommend don't do both. If you're going to set one as percent, set them all as percent. Don't set one as pixel and one at percent, because then it gets kind of confused. Browsers tend to not hyphenate words, so you can have a minimum width. And table layouts are fixed. Table layouts that are fixed are going to ignore the content and set the widths as they are defined. So if you're struggling to get your page to lay out the way that you want, you might want to set your table layout to fixed, or you might want to make sure you set those column widths to make them equal or whatever they need to be to make your site look the way you want it to. At this point, we're going to talk about being able to set the individual sizes of the columns so that they look right. So this time right here, we would really like that to be a little larger than the other times. And we kind of want this Monday through Sunday to be consistent. We want all of those to be the same size because they're all the same, they're all days, and we want to have them have the same priority. So back in our column groups, we don't have to do this up here in the individual columns or anything like that. We can do it with our CSS. So our first column, we're going to set its width equal to 16%. And then if you do the math, you will find that our days column are going to be 12% each. 7 times 12 is going to be 84, plus 16 is going to equal 100. So you have to do a little bit of math. 12%. Doesn't look much when it's shrunk, but when it's all stretched out, you'll see this time here is larger than each of these, but these are all consistent. And they'll word wrap as necessary to fill in their space, but they're a consistent size across. Now we want to make our rows just a little bit bigger because they seem a little smushed. So we're going to come back up to our row styles, and we're going to do our header. So actually we can do it underneath our footer, but we're going to do our table, schedule. If you're inside the T head and you are a TR, so you're a row inside of the head, we are going to call it height, and we're going to set you to 30 pixels. So we're going to make our header, our times, and our days 30 pixels. If you are in table schedule and you are in the T body and you are a T row, so you're a row inside the body, we are going to make you 40 pixels because we can make you a little bit bigger. What that'll do is it'll make sure that everything is consistent here and give you some space for word wrapping. You noticed how the word wrapping would make some rows bigger and some rows smaller. In this case, all of our rows feel like they've got the same height, no matter what the word wrapping is, and they still can word wrap. So even if I stretch this out, still say the big height, the larger height, and it works nicely. We're next going to be setting the width of our columns. So we're going to come back down to or up to our table cell styles. These were just our regular cells that we want to do here. And we want to add some padding and some alignment because it feels like having them in the center probably isn't the best option. So we want to change that. So, whoops. Inside of our table header and our table cells, we are going to be adding a padding of 5 pixels, and we're going to throw in a vertical line at the top, just so that you can see kind of the starting times. There we go. So that's a little nicer to be able to have those where they're top aligned, and we just added in a little bit of padding so that there's a little bit of space there. One of the fun things that we've done with tables is we've allowed other CSS elements to absorb some of the concepts that we've done in tables or applying table styles to those other elements. We can set our display to a table and it will be treated as though it is a table. So we can have a div, or we can have an aside, or we can have an article, and we can set its display to table and it'll be treated like a block level element like a regular table. We can set our display to table row of a given div element, and it will know that it's now a table row, and it'll treat it as a table row when it's trying to build it. So I can create in this example, a descriptive list, and I can create my list saying that I want my list to be the table. I want my list, my DL, and my divs inside my DL. To be the table rows, so I can have those rows in there, and then I can add the DT and the DD elements as my cells. and it will create a table description. So it looks like a table of your descriptive list rather than having it the way that we've been doing it. So just little things that you can do with your table styles now that we know how to use them, you can apply them to other elements. We can have a T-body or a header or a footer or a column group. All of these things can be applied in a display style to specific elements in your CSS. We're not going to actually show you code on that, but that is something that you can look into. When you have a table in your cell phone or in your smartphone, sometimes the responsive design looks bad. Tables tend to look bad on cell phones. Either they're too small, if you're looking at it portrait size, but if you turn it to landscape, that might look a little bit better. Sometimes you only see part of it and you have to scroll, and you know how much we love to scroll with our cell phones. And sometimes that just doesn't fit right. Like the viewport will fit, but then that smushes all of the table cells so that they just don't look good. There are some scripts and frameworks that you can use to define what we call a 2-column table to replace your table. And in these cases, they use a data label to give the column header name and then be able to create the first column as your header, the second column is your data, and you can scroll down using that banded columns concept or banded rows to be able to show you that. If you're interested, this is definitely in the book. Again, we don't do it with this project, but this is something that I think is a really good idea to learn, especially when you're doing mobile devices. One of the extra sections in this is how to design effective web tables. How can you make your web table look good? And there's just a couple of rules that they suggest that you think about. First is make sure that your data and your headers look different. Contrast them in some way, make one bold, change the background color, make your headers and your data look different than each other. Try to avoid spanning your columns or rows unless it's necessary to reduce data. So if you have columns and rows and you're putting in data or in a table, then generally you want the data separated and you want to think about that. You can use icons as necessary. If you need to break up some information or to change some information, you can use icons because they just use less space. Alternating the colors with banded rows, we talked about that. The cell borders, we really want cell borders to be for the purpose of separating the cells. If you want to separate your cells and make it very obvious, go ahead and use your cell borders, but otherwise kind of limit their usage. And remember to keep it brief. Don't make it any bigger than it has to be. Use as small of words as you can or as small of text as you can. Just because when we're designing web tables, especially for a mobile device, we really don't want to get caught up in clutter. So break it into multiple tables if necessary. Do some things to make it so that your web tables look nice on your page. When you do your column layout, we're going to kind of switch over from tables for a second and look at the concept of columns. So we can separate our elements into columns, individual columns. It's kind of the theory of a table, but it doesn't need to be in a table element. You can just have a div and you can just tell it, I want you to have 2 columns. You can just separate them out like that, which is sometimes a much better alternative than setting things up in tables because it will flow and it'll flex a lot easier if it's in a column layout rather than putting them into 2 different tables, assuming that's something you want to do. So we can set the number of columns by setting the column count. So column count equals 2, column count equals 3, whatever we choose to do. It doesn't require the whole table. You just assign it for whatever element you're dealing with. You can also define what we call the column width. How big do we want the individual columns to be? How big do we want the gap between the 2 columns to be so we can increase that gap? We can set a ruler or a column rule that goes a vertical line in between the 2. And we can set what's called widows and orphans. So we talked about widows and orphans before, the idea of having 2 or 3 lines up on the top that should be pulled down to the bottom instead of starting a new section. So we can do our widows and orphans to make sure that we can't have more than or less than 3 items at the top by themselves. Otherwise, they'll be pulled back or pushed forward. We can also set up a column span for our headers. In the example we have here, we moved the header to cross the whole thing, but we're still able to put it into 2 columns. Sometimes people really like multiple columns just because it's easier to visualize. They see the data and it's just a little easier to read rather than reading all the way across the screen. Sometimes that's a little hard to do. Remember, with column layout and with column count, these are all cross-browser support. So you'll see that we'll be using both the Mozilla and the WebKit for each one of these entries. Let's go see what this looks like in some code. We're actually going to be switching over to a different page here, and we're going to go over to our for 4014, which is going to be our Living World article. And we're going to do some column layouts here. So this is the picture of the column right now. One big long column. Doesn't look really great. But we're going to go ahead and play with that one. So the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and close these out. And I've got my column CSS and I have my HTML. Let's go ahead and include my column CSS in my HTML page. And now we're going to do some rules here for our columns. The first thing that we want to do is add a media query to limit it to our media only. So we're going to do our media only, screen, and min width of 641 pixels, because we want to do this for our cell phones. I'm sorry, we want to do this for our tablets and our desktops. Because with a cell phone, it's going to be so small anyway, it's going to fit all in one column. So this is only for our tablets and our desktops. We're going to set our article to have a column count of 2. Now this one has cross-browser support. So you want to make sure that you get those in as well. Yes, we are hoping that at some point you won't have to do this, but for now we do. And now you can see we've turned it into 2 columns. Columns are really nice to be able to visualize things, so we like that. So now that we have our 2-column layout, again, when we make it bigger, it works. It still has 2 columns, and it's just a little easier to scroll to do the 2 columns. Let's see what else we can do to make that just look a little nicer. We can set our column gap size. So inside of this article, we're going to set the gap size. Again, using our cross-browser support, column gap, we're going to set it to 30 pixels. I just added a little bit of a gap here. Next, we're going to add a ruler or a line between them. And for our ruler, we are going to set it to 2 pixels, solid and gray. And see, now we've added that nice little line down the middle. Finally, we're going to set our widows and orphans for our column. Remember, widows and orphans are the amount of paragraph detail or whatever that's going to go at the top or at the bottom. Where is it going to break? So we're going to say that we want our widows to be 3, and we want our columns, our orphans to also be 3. And it just made sure that we started a new paragraph at the top and made sure, even though we've got a little bit of extra space down here at the bottom, that's okay. So now even if you scroll up, it's got top of it here. The next thing we want to do with this is we want to add this header across the top. We want the header to be a column span. So in this case, we are going to go to our article and our H1, so our header, and we are going to do a column span. And we're going to span it all, because no matter how many columns we end up with, I still want it to go across. So WebKit, column span all, and column span all. See how it nicely goes across there? Still does the widow and orphan thing, so we can be sure that we won't have any extra, 1, 2, 3 lines over here. As we scroll this way, we'll see that things fit in kind of nicely there. It's just a little bit nicer to look at, a little nicer to see. All right, so to your assignment. In our review assignment, we're doing essentially one more page of the tutorial. So we're going to have our DLR morning schedule. We did the evening schedule before, which is very, very similar to what we did already. You're going to have a couple of column row or spans, a couple of row spans. You're going to be creating a table, adding in some headers, doing some column groups, and setting all of that. Hopefully by now you're starting to get through your website. If you have it uploaded to your website, send me the link. And we'll see about being able to still submit to D2L if that becomes an issue. Our second project, our case one, is going to be our Marlin Internet ISP. In his website, he has his plan and he has his different styles of his plan. He's got two different types of headers across the top, so you're going to have to figure out how you want to format those two, following the directions, being able to do your column spans, your row spans as necessary, and making these look nice. So have fun with this one. Remember, follow the directions in order and it'll help a lot. Ask for questions if you have them. When you're finished, either push it up to your website or or D2L. All right, so the case 4, please don't be intimidated by this point. When you start your own website, when you start it from scratch, you have to sketch it out first. You have to figure out how you're going to use your table to display your vacancy rate. Where are you going to put the data? What is the table going to look like? Yes, get out a piece of paper and a pencil. I know it's old school. And sketch out what you think it's going to look like. It's going to help you so much more if you sketch it out first. Sketch out or outline your CSS. Figure out what things are you going to need for your CSS. Do you have headers? Do you have tables? Do you have to put in table column rows or individual data cells? Or are you going to do some column groups? How are you going to be doing those? Make sure you add all of those to your CSS as comments before you even start. And it'll help you to kind of know, what should I be doing next? How do I get from point A to point B? Sketch out your page, figure out how you want it to look. Make sure that you go through all of the required aspects. Make sure everything required is in it, because I'm going to run through a rubric and I'm going to say, did you do this? Did you do this? However, I'm really starting to look for your creativity. I'm really starting to look for, how did you make it look? If you purposely put two colors together that look really bad, I'm going to start marking down for that, because they shouldn't. You shouldn't be using this as like, I'm going to just put, teal and hot pink together, which actually they probably do go together. Two colors that don't look good together, and I'm going to purposely put them together just to be silly. I want to see what you can do, and I really want to see what your creative outlet gives you as far as, how is this going to look? How do you think this is going to make a good website? Send me your link. Or zip it and put it into D2L, and have a fabulous week. It's a lot for tables, but hopefully with everything we've learned so far, the tables are starting to make sense. Remember, tables were the original way of layouts before CSS gave us that option. So it's always good to be using some of the old school styles and seeing how they work. Have fun. Talk to you soon.